So good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully we already met today. If not, my name's Rodney King. So Mike asked me to do the keynote. I'm not actually supposed to be on the island, but due to COVID, this is where I've ended up. I'm not complaining. You guys have a beautiful island. So much so that I'm probably thinking about at least spending some time here during the year. So let's see what happens. I put my ancestral visa application in this week. So with any luck, in 3 weeks from now, I will be joining you on a semi-permanent basis. The rest of the year, I stay in Thailand. So if you ever want to come and visit me, we run a retreat down in Rayong, which is about 2.5 hours from Bangkok. Beautiful retreat with my business partner. And we do a lot of workshops there too. So you're always welcome to come say hello. So I'm going to just keep my presentation really informal. If you came to my session this morning, then you know that I'm really big on practical. I try to always bring in some practical aspects to any time that I'm talking. I'll try to do that in this session too. You know, it's all and well if I stand up here and I tell you about all these cool things about mindfulness and some of the neuroscience, which I think is quite important. But at the end of the day, you know, the practical side is where it's really at, because, you know, you can sit here and listen to me all day long, but ultimately you need to be able to take that out into your life. So I'm going to just tell me if I go away from the mic, because I was told I have to stand really, really close. But my presentation is entitled Embodying Mindfulness in Daily Life, so I'm going to unpack that. But one of the first things I want to talk about, and I'll go into this in a little more detail as I go along, but my understanding and my perspective on what it is to live a happy life, and I think we could all agree that that's something we want to do, and we all are in search of happiness, and that's probably one of the reasons why you're here today, and it's one of the reasons you are likely interested in this topic. But I'm going to make the argument, and then I'll explain to you why I see it that way, is that I think what people need to do in order to be happy is they need to learn how to regulate their nervous system. So I'm going to explain to you what I mean by the nervous system in very, very simple terms. But I think a lot of times people go about it in the wrong way. A lot of times what people tend to do, and this is very much what I see in the world, is what I call the Pollyanna effect, where everybody wants to be positive all the time, think positive, say positive things, you know, use positive affirmations. And I think it has its place. But in my experiences, and you probably yourself as well, if you're really honest, it isn't that easy to change your mindset. It's actually quite difficult. And so you can be maybe positive for an hour or so, or maybe 2 days even, but eventually it kind of comes back on you. And one of the reasons I think that happens is because, for one, we were never educated to understand what actually happens in the body and in the brain when we are dealing with stressful situations. And then on top of that, even if you had that knowledge, what could you actually do about it? What are the things that you could do to change that experience? And that's really what I want to talk about. My first point is quite unsettling, and most people don't like this point, but neuroscience backs me up on this, so don't shoot the messenger. But your brain is not actually designed to be happy. I know we don't want to hear that. But really, much of your brain is actually designed to keep you safe. And this is a leftover from our ancestors. And if we went back 100,000, 200,000 years ago, and we looked at our ancestors in the wild, and especially, you know, tribal people, they kind of understanding of what it means to survive was very different to how we see it today. And the brain evolved to keep them safe. That's the brain's job. And when we're talking about anxiety and stressful events and how we face them in everyday life, those mechanisms that are happening inside of you are ancient mechanisms. And so if you understand that, just even in the slightest bit, that can make a huge difference to how you approach difficult situations. So my point is that your brain was mostly designed as a threat detection machine. And because of that, when you are stressed out, you're basically activating that threat response in your brain and your nervous system. And so when I talk about the nervous system, I'm talking about the brain connected to the spinal column and all the nerves that extend through that. And really that's your way of your body informing your brain and your brain informing your body on what it needs to be done. So another way to look at this is you can consider this as a modern world that we live in, but we still have an ancient brain. And that brain hasn't changed at all since the first humans were on this planet. However you define that and however you see that, right, depending on your perspective, but ultimately that brain hasn't changed for a very long time. And it's probably not going to change for a long time. I think the last research that I saw is looking at evolution, probably not for the next 250,000 years. So even in the next 250,000 years from today, we're still going to have that same brain. So although most of us today inhabit a world where there are few and immediate threats to life, our modern brains retain its primitive threat detection system, which is constantly scanning the environment and looking for things that we should be concerned about. So in a way, every time you are stressed out, the way to think about it is the reason you are stressed out is because you are picking up what is perceived as a threat, and then your body goes into an action-oriented state in order to deal with it. The question is, why does this happen? So here's a little bit of neuroscience, but I'm really simplifying this. So if we have anybody in the audience that is a neuroscientist, just please forgive me. All right, but this is like a Cliff Notes version, and I've really only chosen a couple of things that I think is really important to the points that I want to make. So up on, if I step away from the mic, can you hear me? Is that okay? I actually prefer to do that if possible, because it's really difficult standing here and then having to look back all the time, right? But if you look at what I have up on the screen right now, there's a picture of a person. You can see the brain, and there's two important parts inside there. One is the amygdala, and the other one is the hippocampus. So what does this actually mean, and what does it mean to when you're getting stressed out? So the amygdala, which are two little almond shapes, this is from your ancient brain, because depending again who you talk to, but the general consensus is, and it has been for some time, and it is a nice way to explain it, that we talk about the brain as having three brains in one. We have our reptilian brain, which is our ancient brain. We have the mammalian brain, which was built on top of it later on. And then we have the cortex, which is right at the top, which is kind of the new evolution to the brain, and that's kind of where it stopped. When I said the brain hasn't developed, that's where it's got to, and it hasn't evolved since then. That part of the brain, the amygdala, is right in your primitive center. And what it's there for is designed to pick up threats. So when you are faced with a threat, that information coming into your senses is going to be filtered through your amygdala before it goes anywhere else. And what's important to the conversation is, it's one thing when you're actually faced with a real threat. So let's think of our ancestors, walking possibly in the savannah and turning a corner and suddenly being confronted with a lion. What do you think you're going to do when you're confronted with a lion? You're probably not going to sit there and think about it, right? You're going to react straight away, and that reaction is going to be run. And if you can run fast enough and find a tree and climb up that tree, then you're going to survive that day. If not, then you're going to be the lion's breakfast. That part that gets you running and activates that in that instant filters through the amygdala. And so it's an instant, spontaneous experience. This happens even in modern life for us, but sometimes in ways that we wish it didn't. It's something called an amygdala hijacking. And when anytime somebody is faced with an extremely stressful situation, they get overwhelmed by that situation. There's such a huge emotional shock to the system that the extreme of that would be somebody freezing in a situation. So the amygdala is in essence your threat detection. It checks for that, what's coming in from the senses, and it decides, is this a threat? And if it is a threat, then we need to do something about it. There's another part that's connected to that, which is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus you can think about as your memory system. And so the amygdala and the hippocampus are always talking to each other. The hippocampus and the amygdala says, hey, there's a threat. Sends that to the hippocampus, and the hippocampus says, have I seen this before? Have I been in this experience before? Oh, yeah, this is a problem. Okay, you need to start moving. And all of this is happening in a nanosecond. So I might be like, the way that I'm talking about, I'm having a discussion about it, but that discussion is very quick, very brief, and set into motion literally within a microsecond. The problem, of course, is that that's all and well when it's a lion, but when it becomes a problem is when it isn't a life-threatening situation and we have time to start thinking about it. So that's kind of goes into the next part of this. The next thing that's going to happen is that once that amygdala sounds the alarm. The next thing that follows from that is it sends those signals, and there's a nice little diagram. You can come and have a look at it afterwards. You don't need to know all of that, but it sends that distress signal to the hypothalamus, which is another part of the brain, as you can see up there, and then it activates something called the sympathetic nervous system. So when I talked about the nervous system, there's a couple of components to it, but the most important part that you need to know for the talk is this idea of the autonomic nervous system. So if I took the autonomic nervous system, I can separate it into two parts. The one is the sympathetic nervous system, which is where that amygdala is sending that alarm to, and the other one is the parasympathetic nervous system. So why is that important? Well, you can think of the sympathetic nervous system as your action state, right? So when there's a lion and you start running, the reason you're running is because the sympathetic nervous system has done its job and it's getting you all the energy that you need, right? So some of the classic symptoms when you're highly stressed out, and you've probably experienced this at some point in your life, you'll notice that you have dry mouth, clammy hands. A lot of times your vision becomes very acute and very focused, right? You lose peripheral vision. There might be auditory exclusion, so you stop hearing things as well, or maybe you hear things extremely well, depending on the situation. So there's all these things that are happening, and the reason they're happening is to keep you safe. The sympathetic nervous system is exactly that. It's designed to get you action-oriented in order to either move towards or move away from the threat. And I would make the argument that for most people, moving away from the threat is their kind of default setting. In order to move towards a threat, you need to be able to feel that you can actually take it on. Another way that that's described is the fight, flight, and freeze response. So you might have heard that before. So when we talk about fight and flight, what we're really talking about there is the sympathetic nervous system. The most important part is this, is that our threat system will respond the same as it would to a real threat. So when I said, okay, I'm walking down in the savannah and suddenly I'm confronted by a lion, when my body picks up the fact and my sight sees that lion, my alarm system goes off and I run. That makes sense, right? Because if I did that, I'm going to survive. But when your boss gives you a really hard time and you get really angry and upset and you feel all those physiological changes taking place, the adrenaline, the dry mouth, the clammy hands, all of that happening, is because your body is still seeing that as a threat. When it sees it as a threat, its reaction to that would be the same as if it was a lion. So the threat system can't make that distinction, which is where your control, your conscious control can come in and can change that, which is what we're going to talk about in a bit. But I just want to give you just a little bit of that background first. The problem, of course, is when we are confronted with stress, there's a tendency for our thinking mind to go fishing. And what I mean by go fishing is what I talked about this morning, is that we tend to end up telling ourselves stories and narratives to explain why we are feeling or thinking a certain way. And oftentimes that becomes our problem. And one of the things that this whole day has been about is about mindful practice. And so when we talk about mindfulness, one of the things we are trying to do and attempting to do is to circumvent that overthinking mind. Is to circumvent the fact that we always tend to overthink situations. So the outcome of your mind going off on a tangent and creating these narratives is that it tends to feel often for a lot of people that modern stress is constant and that we perceive this as our brain's inability to switch off. So when we talk about, in the kind of more academic terms, rumination, where your mind is always thinking all the time and you never feel like you can switch it off, that's actually connected to the fact that you are stressed out. Because if you weren't stressed out, you wouldn't be overthinking things. That means that your sympathetic nervous system is engaged, even if you're not fully aware of it, and it's running all the time. Because we can't remove the stress valve by typically removing the stressor, so remember, say the toothed tiger or a lion run, your brain continues to problem solve and overdrive. So we overthink it. You don't need to overthink the fact that if you ran away from the lion that it was a really good thing and then you survived. But when the threats to your environment, or at least what you perceive as threats, are not real threats and they're not life and death, that's where the problem comes in. So now what starts happening is we overthink that situation. And it's an overthinking that causes even more stress. that problem-solving mode where we're trying to figure out what's actually going on provides your brain with time to imagine every possible outcome of the stressful experience in the form of a constant dialogue that now occurs between the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So remember I said the hippocampus is your memory system. The prefrontal cortex is this front part of your brain, and your prefrontal cortex is trying to make sense while the hippocampus is saying, yeah, it does make sense. Because these are the situations that arise in my life, and every time it does, this is what's made me stressed out. What this ends up doing is it prevents the brain, and thus the stress response, from returning our physiology back to homeostasis. So the analogy I used this morning is that for most people, what it seems like is, imagine you drove your car home and you left the car on even though you're no longer driving. And so we have this constant underlying anxiety that is within us all the time. And I think one of the things that has been clear from the discussions as I've been talking to everybody today is that one thing that COVID has actually done, the fact that people had to take some time off, is that that made them really aware of how stressed out they actually are. And the thing that's always amazing to me is how adaptable the human body is. So even if you are stressed out, you may not know that, because you get so used to dealing with that stress that you normalize it. And it's only when a situation like COVID arises where you actually have to take some time off and spend some time with yourself, possibly on your own and in silence, that you realize, hold on, you know, actually I'm not feeling so great. There's kind of this low level hum of anxiety all the time. Like I said, like leaving the key in the ignition, leaving the car on, even though you're no longer driving and you've gone back into your apartment. So your prefrontal cortex, which is that front part of your brain, you can think of it somewhat like a time machine. And what it tends to do is it can transport you back to where the challenge started, so whatever that stress was, and then instantly to the future where anything could happen. So you start playing these kind of scenarios in your head. It's what Pema Chödrön, who's a very well-known Buddhist teacher, says: you bite the hook. And one of the things that I mentioned this morning, which is something that the Buddha was very clear on, he said that it's not what's happening to you on the outside that's the problem, it's how you interpret it, your interpretation of that event that causes people suffering. So it's the story, the narrative that we create around it that is the problem. Not so much that the fact that there is potentially a stress, it's how you interpret it on the inside. And what's doing that is this connection between your amygdala, sensing that there is a threat, having a conversation with the hippocampus and saying, is this really a threat? Is this something we've seen before? And if you've created a kind of habit in reacting to certain situations in the same way, oftentimes the thing that stresses you out now stressed you out 5 years ago. So you've created this memory around it, and then the prefrontal cortex picks that up and then tries to justify it and tries to make sense of it. So the question is, and I think this to me is like the most important part of what I want to just bring across, is that what can you actually do about all of this? If this is what's going on, what can we actually do? Because there's not just obviously the mental state of this, you thinking about it, but there's also the physiological change, right? And that's your stress response that's engaged, which is engaging your sympathetic nervous system, which is your, if you want to call it, your action-oriented side of your body. And that puts you in a constant state of anxiety. As I noted, it's useful when there's a real threat, like a lion, but not so useful when it's actually something that isn't life and death, but it might seem that way. And then we play it out like that through the way that we think about it. So what I want to make a suggestion then is that how can we actually regulate our nervous system? And this for me is the thing that really changed my life personally, is that once I realized this, things started falling into place. Like I said, I've tried really hard over the years to change what I would call thinking patterns that are not very helpful, but they're quite hard to change. And the reason is, and the realization was, especially through my research, is that until you change your physiology, you're going to find it very difficult to change your psychology. So it's completely a different approach, I think. Because typically what people want to do is they want to change the way that they think. And so the general analogy would be, well, if I'm thinking negative, and then if I just put some positive thoughts in there, and I do enough positive thinking, I should be able to override the negative thinking. Some of you have probably tried that. You don't even have to tell me, but you probably haven't had much success with that. And the reason is because when you are faced with things that get you upset,
your sympathetic nervous system is engaged, if you like it or not. That threat response of your body is going to engage in that experience. And as long as that engages over and over again, and the more you get stressed out about situations, the more you're going to be in it. And ultimately what happens is you get sympathetic overload. And it's just constant. And you have that constant chemical drop into your body. Things like cortisol is a good example. You might have heard that word before. And it just is there all the time. And it's very difficult to get rid of. And that tells you then that if it's very difficult to get rid of, how are you actually going to do that? And one way you can't do it, typically, is just through thinking. You actually have to change your state. You have to change the physiology. So that's kind of where I want to go with this. First thing is, even though I said that thinking in of itself is not going to necessarily get you onto the path of happiness that you're looking for, it is a worthwhile pursuit to challenge the way that you think. Because that's the first step. There are a couple of things that I use whenever I'm faced with a situation, and then my thinking mind kicks off and it goes into a narrative, and then you go down this rabbit hole of all these possibilities. And oftentimes when you're kind of stuck in that vortex, it's quite hard to get out of. So here are a few questions you can ask yourself. One is you can say, is this thought realistic? I mean, is it realistically? Based on what I'm saying to myself now, do I actually have proof for this? Or am I just assuming, making it up, or creating an interpretation of the event? And oftentimes, if people are really honest with themselves, it falls into those categories. A lot of times, what we think is real isn't really real. It's just our mind making up an imaginary story to justify why we feel the way that we feel. Again, am I basing my thoughts on facts or feelings? So feelings are really important. I talked about that this morning. I want people to trust their feelings to a point, right? Because just because you feel a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that the thinking process behind it is correct. For example, there is a tendency for a lot of people to take the way that they feel and place it into a black and white paradigm, meaning that it's either good or it's bad. But if you can get really aware of how you are feeling in situations, you start to realize that it's on a spectrum. And that possibly what you are defining as anger actually isn't anger, but just frustration. And it's helpful to know that, to be able to have what's called emotional granularity. We know through research that the more emotional granularity you have, meaning that you see emotions on a wide spectrum rather than just black and white, that in people who are able to do that, they tend to be a lot more happy. Kind of what I said, could I be misinterpreting this evidence? You know, am I misinterpreting? Am I actually reading this correctly? Am I viewing the situation as black and white, which I noted? And is it really more complicated? Because a lot of times when you're looking at black and white thinking, that's where you get yourself stuck into a situation where you're always right. And so you don't actually see the nuances. Am I having this thought out of habit, or do I have the facts to support it? So as I said, if we go back to the neuroscience, every time I'm faced with a stressful situation, my amygdala kicks off. But then that creates a memory in the hippocampus. So each time you engage with that experience, and each time you react to it in the same way, that creates a memory. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that memory is correct. Because you think about things that possibly that you were afraid of before, maybe sometime in your life that you're no longer afraid of. How did you overcome that? You changed the way that you interact with it. You changed the story. And that changed the experience. So that's one way, and I call that grounded thinking. It's all about thinking clearly about problems. So that's one way to approach it, right? The second way is what I call attitude embodied. And a cute little elephant. We've had the elephant today already, the pink little elephant, but this one is a more real one. And what you'll notice is he's shaking. So I don't know if people noticed this morning. Sometimes I did say that, but even before I said it, people had already done that. We did a drill. And when you're doing a drill and you're really trying to focus, you really get keyed into that drill and you feel a little bit of tension, because you're moving around. And then I said, okay, let's break, let's switch sides. What did most people do? They shake it off, right? They kind of did this with their body. So that's what I mean by attitude embodied. Shaking is a natural way to release tension and return your body to homeostasis. So at this point, I'm going to talk about something that I haven't mentioned up until now. I said there's the sympathetic nervous system, which is what, right? That's part of your nervous system that's designed to get you ready to take action, the fight-flight response. But there's another side of the autonomic nervous system, and that's called the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's the other side of this autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is really important here because that is the part that gets you back to homeostasis. You can think of it as your calming part of your ANS, your autonomic nervous system. So you've got your action-oriented system, and then you've got your calming system. So if you're really stressed out, of course what you want to do is you want to calm down. The problem with this is in that word where it says autonomic, meaning that it's automatic. And for the most part, it's outside of conscious control. So this is something that we're all familiar with. When you're really stressed out and you tell yourself to calm down and relax, how well does it work for you? Not very well, right? In actual fact, it often has an alternative effect, right? It has an opposite effect. What ends up happening is you get more stressed out. The more you tell yourself to calm down, the more freaked out you get, right? People are nodding their head because you know what I'm saying is right. Everybody's tried that, I've tried that too. And the reason why it's not working is because your sympathetic nervous system is engaged. It's perceiving a threat. It wants to do something about it. All the chemicals that are surrounding that go into action like adrenaline. So you feel all those changes, the butterfly in your stomach, and then you say to yourself, calm down. The problem is that that's not how you can communicate with your autonomic nervous system, because it doesn't use language. You have to then change the way that you're going to talk to your nervous system. And the way that you're going to change it is through, one example, is through an embodied perspective. Actually using your body to change the way that you're thinking. So in the slide before where I said grounded thinking, we were saying, okay, I can change the way that I think through challenging the way that I'm thinking. But I can also change the way that I think through my body. And one way, and this is a very simple example, and there are others, of course, is just shaking it off. And that is something in the English language, right? We say to people when they're really upset about something, we'll say, hey man, just shake it off, just let it go. But we don't actually do the physical action. And so what we need to do is actually do that physical action. So when you feel stressed out next time, and no matter what you've been trying to tell yourself is it's just not working, one way to engage that calming part of your autonomic nervous system is by doing what? By actually physically just shaking it off. There's some really interesting research around this that leads into this, maybe indirectly, but it's still part of the same understanding of the embodiedness of approaching situations and showing up in a different way, is a Harvard professor named Amy Cuddy. And she actually has a really good TED talk on YouTube that you can go and watch. And her whole research was about, as a Harvard professor, she was teaching MBA classes. And she noticed that some of the young people that she was teaching were really good at standing up and presenting their ideas, but other people had a real hard time. The thing for her was, which was she didn't understand, was that everybody in her class were really smart individuals. But yet some people had a real hard time standing up in front of people and actually presenting their ideas. And what she noticed was, and it's very an astute observation, is that she noticed that the main difference wasn't so much about the ideas that they had and their inability to articulate it, but it really came down to their body posture and how they held themselves. So she came up with this research study where she wanted to test that, and she basically categorized two different kinds of postures: a disempowering posture and a power posture, or a power pose. Right? So if anybody's into comics or you've watched the movie Wonder Woman, then you know what I'm talking about. How does Wonder Woman stand? Anybody want to show me? Right? Doesn't she stand like this? Right? So this is a power pose. Right? If I stand like this, it gives you one impression of myself. But if I do this, what does that tell you? You get a different impression. So we are also, it's interesting, right? Because we are naturally designed to read body language. That's how we decide if we want to approach somebody or not approach somebody. Think about maybe somebody that you work with. And just based on how they're standing that Monday morning, you make a decision, this is probably not a good day to go have that conversation with my boss, right? The boss hasn't said anything yet, but where have you made that decision? Just purely based on how that person is standing. right? So not only can we read people's moods based on how they're standing, but the interesting thing about Amy Cuddy's research is that actually how you hold your body will change your physiology. And in turn, when your physiology changes, it's going to change how you feel, which ultimately is going to change how you think. So her experiments with young people, putting them in power poses, and that's just one example. There are other power poses, but that's probably the most iconic one, and it's easy for people to understand that one. She put them in those positions, and then she took a saliva test to see if things changed. And what she noticed was when somebody's in a power pose, their testosterone levels go up and their cortisol levels go down. And if you do the same thing with people that are in a disempowering position, you find the opposite. The adrenaline level goes lower and their cortisol levels go up, which is really something that is put into your body when you're stressed out. So the way that you hold your body has a huge implication on confidence and how you show up in the world. And so just by learning to change how you show up in the world with your body attitude, is the way that I describe it, or attitude embodied, can really change the way that you feel, and then it can ultimately change the way you think. But the reason why it's happening is why? It's changing your physiology. And that is happening on the level of the nervous system, behind the scenes, right? Because your nervous system is there to help you keep alive, right? You don't tell your heart to beat. Your nervous system does that for you. You don't tell yourself to breathe. Your nervous system is doing that for you. When you're stressed out, your autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. That's your, like I said, your action-oriented side, and it gets you ready to deal with the situation. Right? At the same time, you've got your calming part of your system. And the only way that you're going to be able to engage that calming side of your system in one way is by changing how you use your body. And this is just a really simple example of that, just by learning to shake it out. Probably what we've all been talking about today is the idea of mindfulness, and mindfulness is very, very important here. The way that I like to describe it is mindfulness in action, and I suppose I was trying to be smart there with the tagline, but there is a book based on this too, is After the Ecstasy, the Dishes. And what I really mean by that is that it's one thing being able to be in a nice environment like this, be calm, be relaxed, be focused, but completely different when you're in everyday life. As we know, life isn't always nice and it's chaotic. And so when you're in those environments, can you actually bring that practice into your life? That's the part that most people are going to struggle with. And so my advice to people is when we start talking about mindfulness and practicing it, first of all, we need to understand what that is. And something I said this morning was that we don't have a consensus at the present on how we actually define mindfulness. Most people have their own kind of definitions, especially in the research world that I'm in, and you see a lot of people that are researching mindfulness, everybody has their own definition. But I think most of us could probably agree on the very simple definition that I put up on my slide, is that it's the practice of purposely focusing on the present moment, both with whatever's happening on the inside and what you are seeing on the outside, without judgment. And that's the really important part, right? So when you are stressed out, when you are feeling frazzled, there is always going to be a tendency for you to do what? To try to overthink it or to justify that experience. You're going to go into your memories and you're going to find out why, or at least tell yourself why you're reacting in the way that you're reacting. And so you have this thinking process that's constantly going on. The beautiful thing about mindfulness is that it allows you just to be with the experience that you're having without creating a judgment around it. So what I would like to do just at this point, so that I don't put everybody to sleep, I want you just kind of go with me on this, and everybody close your eyes for a moment. So where you sit, close your eyes. Now that you have your eyes closed, I want you just to focus on your breath. Bring yourself to your breath. And just stay with the breath as you inhale and as you exhale. And what you'll find is, as you're doing this, you'll get an idea of what I've been talking about, is that your thinking mind will naturally engage, and you'll have these little intrusive thoughts or images that drop in, even though you should be focusing on your breath. When that happens, all I want you to do is just gently and be polite with yourself. Don't get upset. It's not right or wrong. Move yourself away from those thoughts, from those images.
I know exactly what you mean, especially on the Isle of Man. They're the most underutilized.
So each time, as you feel your mind wandering, you're going to gently bring yourself back
There's a woman on the Facebook group that I'm a member of, the Turner Residence, and she's, so here's a case for you. Her and her son were transferred away to Queen Elizabeth Hospital by air ambulance before he needed a liver transplant.
and when you're ready, you can open
Got
up
the
the
liver
eyes.
transplant. Recovered in Queen Elizabeth Hospital in the UK, and he's couldn't.
So that very simple exercise is mindfulness in action. Just by intentionally bringing yourself to your breath, what you're doing is you are not giving power to the thoughts that are jumping into your mind's eye. Because it's the story that we create around our thoughts, as I said earlier, that create most of our frustrations and our unhappiness. So what mindfulness is teaching us is to not try to get rid of those thoughts or those feelings, because that's not what mindfulness is about, but it's about actually just being free with it without having to explain it. It just is what it is. It's not right or wrong. And when you're able to just sit with the way that you're thinking and feeling, that is a very powerful place to be. But when you do that, what actually happens is, and this is one of the reasons why many people have a practice like this will say, when I actually am being mindful of my breath and I come out of it, I feel calmer. And the reason you feel calmer is because what you've actually done is you've engaged that calming part of your autonomic nervous system. That's another way to engage it. So now you have basically two important tools. You have one, that you can use your body to engage that calming system. The easiest way to do that is to shake it out. The second way is to just be with your breath and allow whatever to arise without trying to change it, without trying to justify it. And if you can do that, then you're already on your path to really learning to regulate your autonomic nervous system, because each time you do that, you engage that calming part of your autonomic nervous system, which is obviously a place where I think all of us would like to be more of the time. The reason I say after the ecstasy, the dishes, because this would be one of the most important pieces of advice that I can give you, is that if you want to practice to be more present, the best place to do that is in the mundane, like washing the dishes. Okay, because I'm sure if I said to you, please wash the dishes, nobody gets excited about it, right? There's always some kind of frustration, there's a bit of tension, maybe like, oh, I'm going to do that again, you get a little bit irritated. That is the perfect moment in time to actually practice to be mindful. So as ridiculous as it sounds, can I be there fully with those dishes? Wash them without having to buy into the narrative. The narrative might be, this is like the 5th night in a row I'm washing these dishes. I thought I've done my turn, right? Shouldn't it be her turn or his turn to do it? Why am I doing it again, right? That's what I mean by creating that narrative, and that's the part that stresses you out. So that's the best time to say, I'm just going to be here with my breath, and I'm going to be fully present in washing the dishes. Where else could you do it? What else kind of irritates people? You go to the store, you go to Tesco's, and there is a line, and you're in a hurry. And it's just like, every single time now I'm in a hurry and I go into the store, there's always a queue. Now there's a line and now this is going to take much longer than it should. That's a perfect time to practice mindfulness. When you're driving in your car and you're getting irritated with other people and the way that they drive and maybe they cut you off, and especially where I come from in Johannesburg, road rage is a big thing. That's a really good time to practice to be mindful. And so one of the easiest ways to be mindful is by using your breath and just staying with that breath and bringing yourself back to it each time. And the difference is, and this is, I would say, is where the distinction I would make between meditation practice and mindfulness. Mindfulness is an action-oriented process. It's something you actually want to apply in your everyday life. Where meditation, as we know, not all meditations, but many of the meditation techniques is doing what? Is sitting on a zafu, on a meditation cushion, and practicing certain things. And it may be, for example, that you are being, maybe you're staring off into the distance and you're focusing on one point in the distance, and you have one pointed meditation. Or it could be meditation just on the breath, that's another way. It could be a mantra meditation where you repeat the same word over and over. But each one of those practices is to enable you to do what? To become more present. Which is great, but at the end of the day, you still have to be present in everyday life, in the everyday things that you do. So my advice always is, choose the things that frustrate you, the small things, and use that as moments of practice. And if you can just have those small victories, and you should give yourself a pat on the back every time you do really well. A lot of times we don't do that, right? Not for the small things. And actually, I can go into that a little bit, not too much, but there's some great research to show that each time you have a small victory, if you validate it, if you give yourself a pat on the back, it's actually really good for you. And it enables you to do the next step, which may be a little bit more difficult, with more ease, because you're building confidence along the road. This to me is probably the most important tool, and what I love about this is that many of the sessions today had a focus on this. So you've already done, most of you have probably done an experience in one way, shape or form with breathing today. And I think we take this completely for granted. Most of us don't give a second notice about how we breathe. One of the things I said earlier in one of my sessions, and I'll mention it again, that if you watch how most people breathe, they tend to breathe from their sternum up. So it's just this part of their diaphragm that's moving. When you see that, and I often see that when I'm working in corporate environments, and I'm watching around a meeting room, and I'm watching how people are breathing, the fact that they're breathing from their sternum up tells me that everybody's completely stressed out. All right? And so the first way to acknowledge that you may be engaging your sympathetic nervous system is by looking in and checking how are you breathing. So that gives you a kind of a key, a marker to say where you are. Because I can tell you right now that if you are stressed out and your sympathetic nervous system is engaged, you are not doing deep diaphragmatic breathing. You're not breathing all the way in. You go to a shallow breath. Because why? The sympathetic nervous system is designed to keep you safe. What it would like you to do is run right now. And so by keeping those breaths short, it's in doing what? It's engaging your energy system. It's getting you ramped up to do something. But the problem is that's not always possible in our everyday life. You can't just run away from situations. You have to face them if you like them or not. If it's a lion, it's a good idea, right? If it's a difficult person at work, well, you can only run for so long, right? And at some point, you're going to have to engage with that person. And so breathing is very important when we start talking about engaging that calming part of your body. Why is that? It comes back to what I said earlier, is that your autonomic nervous system is automatic, it runs on its own, and you don't have a lot in the way of having a conversation with it. And the way that you can have a conversation with it is through your breathing. And so medical science has shown this, and it's very interesting research, is that if you focus on your exhale, specifically the out-breath engages that calming part of your autonomic nervous system. Specifically the out-breath, not the in-breath. Right? So if you are stressed out, what do you think I'm telling you to do? What should you do? You should check in, focus on your breathing, but specifically which part of your breathing, that out-breath. And as you engage your out-breath, what's going to happen is you're going to engage that calming side of your autonomic nervous system. So there you have three important tools, right? We have one in the sense that I can do what? I can change the way that I use my body in order to affect the calming state that I want to look for and what I need, especially in a stressful situation. I can use mindfulness by being more present without judgment to do the same. And then thirdly, and most importantly, and probably one of the most important tools, is learning to focus on the out-breath. And when you focus on the out-breath, that is an effective way of engaging your calming system. The other part of it is, if you were at my session this morning and we did the pink elephant drill, remember that one? The other part of that is that when you are focused on your breath, specifically your out-breath, you tether yourself to the present moment, which is also a really good thing. So it helps you become more present. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope it made some sense. I hope you got some value out of it and you learned something. It's kind of difficult to do it this way. As I said this morning too, I said the worst thing that we can do in our business is have a conversation like this. Because actually it's something that you need to experience. But the mere fact that I'm telling you about it kind of takes away from the experience. So I think if you came to the sessions this morning that I ran, you would have realized that what I'm saying is true, because we had a lot of these kind of epiphanies this morning as we unpacked it. But it does give you a little bit more of the background of why these things are happening. And my final point will be that if you can learn to manage your physiology, especially your nervous system, more effectively, you will end up changing the way that you think and ultimately the way that you feel. Because I'm in lockdown on the island and I wasn't supposed to be here, I don't have business cards, but that's the way to get hold of me if you need to. I think we've got a little bit of time, I'm not sure. Mike, do we have a bit of time? If anybody wants to ask me any questions, that's actually what I prefer to do anyway. Should have just done a Q&A. Any questions? Yes?
So, when you spoke about shaking, I love that, I love shaking. And it's just learning, isn't it? You know, breathing versus shaking. You know, people in that high level of stress or high level of anxiety, I think
Can be difficult.
Really difficult. So, have you got any advice on sort of, if it's just about checking in and going, what do I need now? Have you got any advice on doing breathing or doing shaking? Because it can be a fine line on which.
So I think you can play them off each other.
Yeah.
So you could get that shaking action first as a way to engage that calming part of your autonomic nervous system. And then as you start doing that, you can lock into breathing. So I found that when you describe what you said now, when people are struggling to just kind of tap into their breathing, which can be hard when they're really stressed out, just shaking out enables them to do that. So you kind of go in the opposite direction, right? So you use the body as a way to get into that breathing frame. So that would probably be an effective way. Anything else? You must have done really well. It's only one question.
Especially, it seems focused on the outlet. Sometimes if you're combining it with intention to breathe out without what you don't want, breathing what you do want. So I heard that spun up his head recently about breathing in without breathing out.
I think if it works for you, then go ahead and do it. But I think the science is still important, right? I don't think necessarily that's the reason why it's working. I think the reason why it's working is that when you intentionally focus on that out breath, you engage that calming side of your autonomic nervous system. This is a natural occurring thing. So, like I said, you can tell yourself to calm down, it doesn't work. But guaranteed, if you focus on that out breath, you will bring some calmness to the state that you find yourself in. Now, by no stretch of the imagination am I saying suddenly you're going to be 100% calm, right? But it will aid you in doing that. Then I think the next step is to, for example, do breath work, because you can take that even deeper. I mean, I have a couple of sequences that I personally do. One of the things we did in the second session, I said about that double barrel breathing, where you take 2 short breaths in and then 1 long exhale. I find that works really well when I'm stressed out. And so that's something that you could possibly try in your own life, and you can do it multiple times. And the cool thing about the breathing part of it is that you don't need any equipment to do it, and other people don't even need to know that you're doing it, right? So I could be standing there and this person can really be kicking off and going crazy, and I'm like, just focus on your breath. Just while they're going off. And I can keep myself in a completely different space to them. So that's one way. Another way, which is what's called box breathing. Anybody heard of box breathing? That's a Navy SEAL exercise, right? So the SEALs do this, where there's different methods, but basically you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, or breathe out for 4, breathe in for 4, breathe out for 4, and you do that like you would do on a box. So you do it 4 times. And then you just go back to normal breathing, and you start again. Breathe in for 4, exhale for 4, breathe in for 4, exhale for 4. I like that technique, but it's not a technique that's highly accessible in, say, a work environment where you're dealing with a situation. You can't just start going through box breathing. It can be quite difficult to pull off. Maybe if you could get yourself to the restroom and take some time out. Go, okay, I'm going to close the door, I'm going to do box breathing. That'll work really well, all right? But the one that I said, the double barrel one, that's something you can do pretty much anywhere. And as soon as you do that, because that focus on that exhale comes in, you engage in that parasympathetic nervous system. The example that I use, like when I'm teaching at Singapore Airlines, I work with a lot of cabin crew. And I really tried to get them to understand this because they deal with a lot of stressful situations on an aircraft, mainly with passengers that are being rude and obnoxious, and so they get stressed out. And so when I'm trying to explain this to them, they haven't actually had this understanding and they don't know what we're talking about when we're talking about autonomic nervous system and stuff. I say, well, you know, have you ever seen when somebody gets really like a massive anxiety attack and they're hyperventilating? What's one of the things that people suggest that they do? What do you do normally? But what do you give them, huh?
Brown paper bag.
Brown paper bag, right? That's the classical one, right? Give them a bag. Any bag. Doesn't have to be brown. But give them a bag, right? Okay. What's the next thing you tell them to do with the bag?
Exhale.
Exhale and blow the bag up. So you actually want like a balloon, right? Blow it up like a balloon. Why are you telling them to do that? Because it's engaging the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the calming side of their autonomic nervous system. So you're engaging that process that's within you by using breath. That's the reason why I do it. So normally when I tell them that, they're, oh, okay, that makes sense. I get that. All right? So you can invoke that at any time. That's why I think breathing is probably one of the best ways to change your nervous system into the direction that you want it to be. Now, of course, I want to make it clear, though, that sometimes you may want to ramp yourself up. Right? Maybe you're a sports person, you're going to go into competition, you know, you want to feel like ready for that experience, and maybe you don't, and you can use your breathing to get you into that as well. So now, shorter breaths are actually a good thing for you, because as you start breathing short breaths, what do? You engage the sympathetic nervous system, right? So you can actually get that in. So we say fight and flight, but maybe that's not the best way to describe it. That is how it is described in the literature. Maybe a better way to describe it is your action system. And sometimes that's very important to have, right? In a life and death situation, you're going to be very thankful that you have a sympathetic nervous system. Because without it, you wouldn't be able to confront that threat that's in front of you. You need that. So it's not all bad. It's just that, unfortunately, we're engaging that sympathetic nervous system in so many of the wrong places, right? In silly things that don't need to get us stressed out. And so when you find yourself stressed out, one of the best ways to deal with that is through actually engaging your breath. Anything else?
I missed the workshop this morning. What did you do there?
So what I did this morning was I took these ideas, but I really put them into a practical sense. So I made people do drills with their body. And what I do is what I call contrast. So I'll show you a drill, but I don't give you a lot of feedback on it. And then I get you to give me the feedback. You say, well, this is kind of what happened. And then I show you a different way to do the drill where we hook in some of these ideas. And then you give me feedback again. And typically the feedback's pretty positive. Right? Oh, I can actually feel the shift. And so that's kind of my perspective, is that if you experience it through your body, then there's more likelihood that you're actually going to use it in everyday life. Then just sitting, this is why this is not the best way to do it, right? To sit and have a conversation about this. But luckily we've had a lot of experiential workshops today, so you already had that opportunity. But you actually want to experience it. When you feel that embodied shift, you're more likely to be able to recreate it in everyday life. So that's what we did this morning. Didn't have enough time. The hour went really quickly. There's a lot more stuff I could have done. But I think it gave everybody at least an idea of where we're trying to move towards. Anything else? Cool. All right.